Welcome to episode 49 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week it is the podcast's first anniversary, so I'd just like to say a couple of things before we go any further. Being completely honest, it feels almost unbelievable that I've now been doing this for a year. And so I'd just like to say, first and foremost, a huge thank you to every single person who listens. I'm always rather amazed that people tune in to hear me disappear down somewhat random cinematic rabbit holes every week. And so whether you've been here since day one or whether this is your first episode, I'd just like to say I'm incredibly grateful for all of your support. It means a lot more to me than you could possibly know. So thank you all very much. So I chose our first film this week to reflect the fact that the traditional gift for first anniversaries is paper. And so we're opening this week's episode with Paperhouse from 1988. This stars Charlotte Burke, Glenne Headley, Elliott Spiers and Gemma Jones, and marked the feature film debut of British director Bernard Rose. And Bernard Rose also directed our second film of the week, which is Candyman from 1992. This is based on a short story called The Forbidden by Clive Barker and stars Tony Todd, Virginia Madsen, Cassie Lemmons, Xander Berkeley and Vanessa Williams. Along the way, we'll be discussing the slightly nebulous landscape between children's fiction and horror, the early careers of Bernard Rose, Tony Todd and Clive Barker, the true crimes that inspired Candyman, the controversy surrounding the film's release, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing Paperhouse, I have referenced interviews and articles on the websites filmfreakcentral.net, bfi.org.uk, theotherfolk.blog and scifinow.co.uk. And when discussing Candyman, I have heavily referenced the book Candyman by John Towson, published as part of the Devil's Advocate series of books from Liverpool University Press. I've also referred to Clive Barker's original story, The Forbidden, and interviews, commentary tracks and extras on the special edition Blu-ray release from Arrow Video, as well as interviews and articles on the websites clivebarkerarchive.com, clivebarker.info, theguardian.com, horrornewsnetwork.net, people.com, flexiblehead.blog, and movingpictureshow.com. And for both films, as always, I have also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the authors, movies, directors, cast and crew. Paperhouse was based on a children's book called Marianne Dreams by the writer Catherine Storr and occupies a nebulous and liminal space between the world of children's fiction and the world of horror. Tapping into primal childhood fears, including entering adolescence, family trauma, fear of abandonment, and our first encounters with death, the film shares some of the qualities of other literary works, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Chronicles of Narnia, and the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. We can also see it as a gateway horror movie for younger viewers, in much the same way as films like Monster House from 2006, or the unbelievably terrifying Return to Oz, which starred a young Fairuza Balk and was released in 1985. Writer Catherine Storr, who was born in London in 1913, was certainly not afraid of inspiring fear in her young readers or depicting the nature of evil in her writing. She once said that its purpose was to help children understand that evil is, quote, something they already know about or half know. It's not something right outside themselves, and this immediately puts it not only into their comprehension, but it also gives them a degree of power. End quote. This premise formed part of a lecture titled Fear and Evil in Children's Books that she gave as part of a keynote speech at the UK's first academic conference on children's literature in 1969. In this, she argued that acts of cruelty and violence found in children's books help young readers to acknowledge the dark and conflicting feelings that they harbour from infancy, saying, quote, "What we have to do is tell children that yes, these feelings exist in us as well as in you, and this is how, in our society, you should try to express them." End quote. And to be fair, she knew of what she was speaking. Although she never worked professionally with children, she had both a degree in medicine and also spent over 13 years acting as the senior medical officer in the Department of Psychological Medicine at the Middlesex Hospital in London. And she was also certainly not alone in this opinion. Maurice Sendak, the author of the children's classic Where the Wild Things Are, shared a similar perspective. He said that children need a safe place to air their emotions, deepest fears, and what he called inexplicable notions. And he described his own works as helping children, quote, "master various feelings, danger, boredom, fear, frustration, and jealousy, and manage to come to grips with the realities of their lives." End quote. C.S. Lewis, the creator of the Chronicles of Narnia, held a similar perspective, once saying that since it is likely that children will meet cruel enemies, writers should teach them about heroic courage. And more recently, Philip Pullman, the creator of the His Dark Materials series, argued that because children are already fully acquainted with fear, pain, shame, and loss, stories should help them understand these experiences rather than avoid them. We've already spoken at length in this series about the horrors of the classic fairy tale, particularly those written by the Brothers Grimm, which often featured child abandonment, cannibalism, mutilations, demons, curses, and transformations. Though these were, of course, intended more as cautionary lessons in morality, rather than explorations of the developing child psyche. Beyond these, though, we can probably trace horror-tinged children's literature back to the Victorians, who, as we've already discussed, were fascinated with the spiritual and the Gothic, interests that began to filter into fiction for children. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, while highly entertaining, are also truly nightmarish, featuring threatening adults, dream logic, insanity, and bodily distortion. But perhaps one of the most interesting examples from the period is Struwwelpeter, or Shock-Headed Peter, which was written and illustrated by the German psychiatrist Heinrich Hoffmann and published in 1845. Shock-Headed Peter is made up of 10 illustrated and rhymed cautionary tales, and is one of the first books for children to combine visual and verbal narratives, predating the comic book by many years. He created it for his 3-year-old son because he thought that, at the time, there was a lack of good books available for children. The tales include the title story about a boy who never washes, another about a little girl who plays with matches and, as a consequence, burns to death, some racist children who are dipped in ink to teach them a lesson, and perhaps most famous of them all, the story of the Thumbsucker, wherein a little boy called Conrad has his thumbs cut off by the Scissor Man as a consequence of his bad habit. Since its publication, it has been incredibly influential and has been adapted for stage, film and opera, including a multi-award-winning 1988 British production, adapted by the Tiger Lilies and featuring one of my favourite performers, Julian Bleach. As the world moved into the Edwardian era, these themes became even more prominent. The writer E. Nesbit frequently featured supernatural threats and ancient evils in her work, while J.M. Barrie's novel Peter Pan is, if you read it today, actually far darker than you might remember, filled with death imagery, predatory adulthood, lost children, and existential loneliness. This becomes all the more apparent on reading Barrie's original manuscript, which was discovered and then published in 2019, and which is, much like Alice in Wonderland, a far cry from the sanitized versions produced by the Walt Disney Company. By the time we reached the 1950s, the seeds planted in the pre-war and interwar years had taken root, and modern children's uncanny literature truly began. 1954 saw the publication of The Children Agree No, the first in a series of supernaturally tinged books by the writer Lucy M. Boston, while Marianne Dreams was published in 1958. Although not out-and-out horror, they dealt with dark post-war anxieties, and also paved the way for what was to follow, namely the works of writers like Joan Aiken, Alan Garner, and Roald Dahl, who alternated between children's literature and more adult tales of unease. One particular favourite from this period is the Ghastly Crumb Tinies by Edward Gorey, which was published in 1963. Gorey, who went on to win a Tony Award for the costumes for the 1977 stage revival of Dracula, possibly took some inspiration from Shock-Headed Peter, with his illustrated rhyming list of 26 children meeting terrible ends. Amy falls down the stairs, Basil is eaten by bears, Ernest is choked, Hector is drowned, and Maud is swept out to sea. And much like Hoffman, this work has become highly influential, and you can certainly see its DNA in the stories of the fictitious author Lemony Snicket and his 13-part series of children's books, A Series of Unfortunate Events, which began publication at the end of the 1990s. Following Catherine Storr's keynote speech on Fear and Evil at the tail end of the 1960s, the world of children's horror literature exploded, with collections like the Armada Ghostbook series, and volumes including the Beaver Book of Horror and the Usborne Guide to the Supernatural World. These featured supposedly true accounts of hauntings, werewolves and vampires, and occasionally I've read from them over the course of this series. This period also coincided with, in Britain at least, incredibly dark TV shows for children, including the 1969 adaptation of The Owl Service, based on a book by Alan Garner, 1972's Escape into Night, which was based on Marianne Dreams, and Children of the Stones and King of the Castle, both of which were released in 1977. Not to mention, of course, the dark and occasionally brutal British public information films aimed at children, which featured more deaths than a Friday the 13th movie, and which I've also discussed in earlier episodes. Meanwhile, in the States, 1981 saw the publication of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, a mixture of campfire stories, urban legends and folk tales that became enormously successful, partly because of the illustrations by Stephen Gammell, and these would eventually be adapted for the big screen in 2019 by horror maestro André Øvredal. The success of these books then paved the way for young adult series like Dark Forces, which began publication in the early 1980s, with titles like The Doll, The Game and Devil Wind. And this was followed by later collections like Point Horror, Fear Street and Goosebumps, most of which now need no introduction at all. Today, children's fantasy horror is everywhere, with writers like Anthony Horowitz, Darren Shan, Lemony Snicket and Joseph Delaney employing the same combinations of anxiety, fear and psychological insight used by so many writers before them. And while the subtext may now have morphed into the horrors of the modern world, including mental instability, drug addiction, toxic relationships and abuse, the intent to help younger readers explore their emotions in a safe and cathartic environment remains pretty much the same. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is Paperhouse from 1988, based on the novel Marianne Dreams. This stars Charlotte Burke, Glenne Headley, Elliott Spiers and Gemma Jones, and was the feature film debut of director Bernard Rose. Bernard Rose was born in London in 1960 and became fascinated with visual storytelling and cinema from a very early age. By the age of 9, he was making his own Super 8 movies, and in 1975 he won an amateur filmmaking competition for the BBC, with his winning 3-minute short subsequently broadcast on the channel. One key inspiration was director Nicholas Roeg and his 1973 movie Don't Look Now. Rose first saw this when it screened in the UK as a double bill with the folk horror classic The Wicker Man, which must have been quite the combination for a 13-year-old boy. Of this experience, he later said, quote, "I saw them one after the other and was completely blown away by Don't Look Now. It was poetic, terrifying, moving, emotional, and believable. It was, and still is, my favourite horror film. And then I remember watching The Wicker Man. And when horror fans say, "Oh, isn't The Wicker Man great?" I go, it's alright. Because after seeing Don't Look Now, The Wicker Man just looks so dull and flat. What Don't Look Now has that The Wicker Man doesn't is a complete mastery of cinema. Don't Look Now is almost a silent movie, a brilliant, coherent, original and fantastic film that has enormous emotional impact. End quote. From here, he attended the National Film and Television School in London and also began working with the great Jim Henson, firstly on the last series of the original run of The Muppet Show, and then again on the nightmarish fantasy The Dark Crystal, which was released in 1982. On graduating with a master's degree in filmmaking, Rose entered the film industry through music videos, which had become an incredibly popular and often groundbreaking format following the rise of MTV. Rose's videos include Small Town Boy by Bronski Beat, Red Red Wine by UB40, and most notorious of them all, Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood. This is a less than subtle exploration of gay leather bars and sadomasochism that, along with the song it supported, was banned by the BBC. But in a stunning example of the Streisand effect, long before that term had even been coined, the controversy instead helped propel the song to the top of the UK music charts, and also launched Frankie Goes to Hollywood to stardom. Of this period, and of this specific video, Rose has said, quote, "I was very lucky to work during a period where producers and MTV were like, make what you want, and so we did. And with Frankie Goes to Hollywood, ultimately they did think we went too far. But it was just capturing the moment, creating visuals that were interesting. It was like making silent movies. We could tell these young guys stories and express stuff that they were trying to get at through the music." End quote. Much like David Fincher after him, many of Bernard Rose's music videos can be seen as miniature movies, developing the skills that he had begun to cultivate at the age of 9 and which he later honed at the National Film and Television School. It was only natural then that his next move would be into television, with the TV movie Labour of Love appearing in 1984, followed by episodes of a TV drama called Prospects in 1986. In the same year, he also directed a BBC TV movie called Smart Money, followed by another called Body Contact in 1987. And then in 1988, he released his feature directorial debut, which was, of course, Paperhouse. And now it's that time of the show where we are getting into spoilers for the book, the movie, and for those of you with a taste for retro British television, the children's TV series Escape into Night, which was the first adaptation of Storr's novel and originally aired on ITV in the UK in 1972. And you can currently find all episodes of this series, though unfortunately only in a very grainy black and white format, on YouTube. Although Paperhouse was based on Catherine Storr's 1958 novel, it must be said that she was less than happy with the adaptation, particularly Bernard Rose's decision to push the material into darker and more adult territory, replacing her more abstract horrors with a hammer-wielding father figure and introducing themes of potential child neglect, alcoholism, and possibly psychological abuse. She was also apparently less than happy with the ending, which is far bleaker than that of her original work, which comes to a far more positive conclusion. Rose was first introduced to the novel by his then partner and future wife, the British actor Alexandra Pigg, and the poetry of the writing and the central conceit was immediately intriguing. He later said of this, quote, "Catherine Storr was a child psychologist, so she wrote the novel from a position of knowledge rather than fantasy, and I think that underpins it. That's part of what's so powerful about it. There's something about the way that dreams operate in the novel that feels very accurate, and there was something very poetic and universal about the story that was unique in a spooky way." End quote. The basic premise of the book, film, and the TV series is essentially the same, though the stories do diverge somewhat as the different mediums progress. A young girl, Marianne, in the book and TV show, and Anna in the film, is confined to bed due to an illness, though in the TV show it's actually as a result of a riding accident. Drawing a picture of a house to occupy her time, soon after she finds herself visiting the house in her dreams, and as she gradually becomes more ill, finds herself becoming increasingly trapped, with attempts to make things better by changing the picture, only making matters worse. Enraptured by the novel, Rose spoke with one of his contacts from his music video days, a man called Tim Bevan. Bevan had founded Working Title Films, a production company that would go on to produce the out-and-out horrors that are Notting Hill and Love Actually, as well as the far more acceptable Oh Brother Where Art Thou, The Big Lebowski, and Hot Fuzz. Paperhouse would be the company's fifth feature production, and financing was obtained from Vestron Pictures. Vestron, however, only agreed to fund the project as long as it avoided an R rating, a requirement that restrained the levels of horror and violence depicted throughout the film. As mentioned though, Rose was keen to push the film into darker and more adult territory, and the character of Anna is very different from the character of Marianne in the novel, and who is here presented as a very troubled and rebellious pre-teen. Within the first few minutes of the movie, we see her reacting rather violently to a fellow classmate with whom she clearly has some long-standing animosity. She is then sent out of the schoolroom by the teacher, where she immediately tries to draw her classmates' attention by making faces through the window. Told off again by the teacher, she complains of being unwell, and the audience is left to guess whether this is the truth or simply a bid to gain more attention. When she does indeed faint and is collected by her mother, she tells her that she faked the entire thing. And though we later realise that this was itself a lie so that she could go horse riding, it is quite clear that Anna has, at best, a passing relationship with the truth. She even later lies to the doctor about her condition, saying that she has never had any fainting spells, which is presumably another ruse to get her out of the ordeal of staying in bed. Anna is played by Charlotte Burke in her first and only film performance, and who was chosen from over 1,000 girls during an open casting process. In my opinion, her performance is rather uneven, but it was widely praised at the time of the film's release and also even today in retrospective reviews. As an adult though, I find it incredibly hard to relate to her because she is, for much of the movie, an incredibly annoying brat. As we will discover though, there may be underpinning reasons for this, and that it likely stems from her dysfunctional family background, more on which later. On the cusp of adolescence, she experiments incredibly clumsily with makeup and also discusses snogging with her friend, who recounts kissing several boys at a recent party, some upstairs, some downstairs, and some on the sofa. But at the same time, Anna is also clearly a child, wanting to play hide and seek, an event which leads her to fainting once again and requiring police intervention. And I have to say, while her mother, played by Glenne Headley, welcomes her back with open arms and a kiss, my own mother would likely have skinned me alive and grounded me until I reached adulthood. As to the frantic search for the misplaced picture later in the movie, accompanied by petulant screaming, don't even get me started. Anna is joined in her fantasy world by a boy called Mark, who is also an invalid in the real world. He is played by a young actor called Elliott Spiers, and I would venture to say that his performance is better than Burke's, especially given that some of the written dialogue is rather clunky at points. Tragically, Spiers died in 1994 at the very young age of 20, when he suffered an adverse reaction to anti-malaria medication during post-production for his second and final film, Taxandria. This knowledge gives the character of Mark and the climax of the film a tragic resonance, and one can only wonder where his talents might have led him had this not been the case. Mark, we learn, suffers from muscular dystrophy, which is revealed to us and to Anna by an incredibly indiscreet doctor who seems to never have heard of patient confidentiality. Unlike Anna, however, he has no knowledge of the real world beyond the Paperhouse, saying, when she asked how he got there, that, quote, "They left me here. I must have done something wrong," end quote. Who they are and what his wrongdoing might have been is never explained or referenced again, suggesting that it is some form of guilt that he holds inside, possibly as a result of his illness. He is also the one who warns Anna that the house and the moorland isn't safe, though again, we never find out what might have happened to lead him to this conclusion. As the narrative continues and the two become increasingly ill in the outside world, the dream state begins to take a far darker turn, and the two find themselves becoming increasingly menaced by Anna's creations. In the book and the TV show, the threat comes from animated rocks surrounding the house, while in the film, the threat comes from a monstrous representation of Anna's absent father. In this respect, the film pushes into far darker and more dangerous territory than Storr's novel, exploring dysfunctional family dynamics, alcoholism, and potentially child abuse. And this, of course, might account for Anna's previously mentioned rebellious behaviour, and also her mother's seeming reluctance to exert much discipline at all towards her daughter. Dad is ostensibly away working, but as one commentator has suggested, he may well actually be away at some form of drying out clinic. At the very least, there are suggestions that his drinking has certainly taken its toll on his family. We first encounter him in a photograph being developed by Anna's mother in her darkroom, his face distorted by the ripples of developing fluid and eventually blackening under the chemical influence when the print is left in the tray for too long. When Anna attempts to draw him, she declares that he looks like a madman, and then goes on to tell her mother, "I think he looks drunk. I hate it when he's drunk." This causes her to scribble his face out in the first of many alterations to her picture that will have nightmarish consequences in the dream world. First, we see him lunge towards the camera in one of the film's only and genuinely effective jump scares, and then he appears as a silhouette on the Paperhouse skyline, his voice rumbling across the moorland as he calls for his daughter and screams at her that he is blind, a consequence of her scribbling at his face with her pencil. He then becomes not the figure of rescue that Anna had originally hoped for, but a figure of terror, wielding a hammer accompanied by discordant screeches on the soundtrack as he strides across the moors and attempts to break into the house. Played by the British actor Ben Cross, he is also responsible for the film's most uncomfortable moment, when he repeatedly thumps on Anna's chest as she lies screaming on the moorland. But as we later discover, this is in fact a filtering of reality into the dream world, with his lines and his actions really those of a paramedic called in to resuscitate Anna when she falls into a coma. Although the characters and the specifics of the story change across the different storytelling formats, one thing that remains fairly consistent is the Paperhouse itself, which is described in Storr's novel as follows. Quote, "She drew, as she nearly always did, a house with 4 windows and a front door. The walls were not quite straight because she wasn't ruling the lines, and the chimney was a little large. Over the chimney she drew a faint scribble of smoke. She drew a fence around the house and a path leading from the front door to a gate. She put some flowers inside the fence, and all around she drew a long scribble of grass, which she hoped would be waist high at least. In the grass outside the fence, she drew a few large, rough-looking stones or lumps of rock, like those she had seen on the moors in Cornwall." End quote. The house in the movie is certainly impressive, capturing the distortions of a child's drawing made flesh, and rising from its moorland setting like a giant grey monolith. The art direction and design was provided by Anne Tilby and Gemma Jackson, the latter of which would go on to work on Game of Thrones, while the cinematographer was Mike Southern. On his website, Southern recalled that the filming process allowed him to explore how his own dreams felt, and what he called the, quote, paradoxical, surreal reality that can haunt the hours after one wakes, end quote. Although some external shots of the house were filmed on Dartmoor in England, the majority was filmed on a soundstage at Pinewood Studios to give as much control over lighting and atmosphere as possible. Much of this was facilitated by a mid-1980s slump in the British film industry, which allowed a relatively low-budget movie access to studio spaces that would normally have been far outside their reach. Within the soundstage, the moorland was kept alive by UV lights and regular overnight watering, to the extent that by the end of the shoot, the team had effectively created their own microclimate, with various forms of wildlife establishing themselves across the set. Because the house and its contents have been drawn by a child, Rose and his team had free rein to create surreal and dreamlike imagery, both in the distortions of the house exteriors and the interiors once Anna finds her way inside. Rose has said that it was on this film that he realised that film is, essentially, a dream already, and therefore, in this regard, there is no difference between the dream state in the movie and the film's reality, going on to say that the whole of Paperhouse really exists to illustrate this one point. This is all helped enormously by the use of practical visuals and painting that create a far more unreal world than we would perhaps achieve today with CGI, which Rose has said would have enabled more things to happen in the movie, but which would ultimately have also been far less interesting. The looming exteriors, which are reminiscent of the house by the river in Charles Laughton's film Night of the Hunter, are shot from Charles Eye level, and we also have a myriad of surreal images inside, which come across as a combination of Dr. Seuss, Salvador Dali and René Magritte. There is a pair of disembodied legs standing on the lower levels of a staircase that explode into dust without warning. There's also a large metal ice cream machine, a bizarrely overly large radio mounted on the wall of a room filled with candles, a stretched and disproportionate boy's bicycle, and a tea party in the upstairs room comprised of towering burgers and oversized misshapen drinking glasses. Magritte also serves as the inspiration for the towering black and white lighthouse looming against a blue sky filled with white clouds, which recalls several of his famous paintings, including my personal favourite, Empire of Light. And this is not the only painting referenced in the movie. When Anna first wakes up on the moor outside the house, the cinematography deliberately invokes the painting Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth, while the brief scene of Mark lying seemingly dead across the bed acts as a reconstruction of the painting The Death of Chatterton by the pre-Raphaelite artist Henry Wallace. Anna's mother is played by Glenne Headley, an American actress who was once briefly married to John Malkovich, with whom she worked at the Steppenwolf Theatre Company. Following several award-winning stage plays, she began her screen career in a number of supporting roles, before achieving fame with her performance in the comedy Dirty Rotten Scoundrels in 1988, the same year that Paperhouse would be released. She would go on to appear in many films and TV shows after this, including Dick Tracy in 1990 and Mr. Holland's Opus in 1995, as well as Emmy-nominated performances in the TV shows Lonesome Dove and Bastard Out of Carolina. An immensely talented actress, if her performance in this film seems a little off, she can perhaps be forgiven. Although she had portrayed Anna's mother with her usual American accent, after filming it was decided that her character should be British, requiring post-production dubbing that seems slightly at odds with the rest of the film. And I think we have to admit that her character, while clearly a very caring woman, is also hardly going to win Mother of the Year, at least not to a modern retrospective audience anyway. She smokes in the confines of the car with her daughter, she nearly lets her drown in the bathtub, and she also, rather carelessly, leaves a tea light burning by the bed, which may assist Anna in the dream world, but also almost results in their flat being burned down. At least, though, she does manage to redeem herself in the film's final moments, when she saves Anna from the cliff top as she waits precariously on the edge. Anna is waiting here for Mark to collect her in his helicopter, a mode of transportation that initially represents freedom from illness, loneliness and fear, but which ultimately represents death. And in the real world, of course, this is most likely a police helicopter called out to search for Anna when she runs away from the seaside hotel in which her family is staying. As a debut feature, there is much in Paperhouse that foreshadows the director's later film Candyman, with its blending of fantasy and reality and narrative of a lonely character seeking escape and validation. In Paperhouse, it is through dreams and fantasy, and in the second, it is through the relentless pursuit of a mythical figure and also gothic romance. There are also similarities in the use of music, which was here initially provided by the composer Stanley Myers. However, this original orchestral score was ditched before the film's release, at the insistence of the American producers, though Rose himself thinks this was more to do with the film itself than actually with the score, saying, quote, "I think they didn't like the film, to tell the truth. They thought it was too strange and arty, and they thought if maybe they put a more aggressive score on it, it would somehow punch it up a little." End quote. The score was handed over to Myers' assistant, Hans Zimmer, who would go on to score films including the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, Gladiator, Interstellar, and Dune. Paperhouse would be one of the future Oscar winners' earliest film scores, and was created on a synclavier, a pioneering 1980s digital synthesizer, which was one of the earliest systems to allow musicians to sample sounds and then manipulate them. Despite the incredibly fast turnaround time, Zimmer's score is highly effective, and it also anticipates the electronic and dominating minimalist score that would be created by Philip Glass for Candyman. Paperhouse, new score and all, was completed just in time for its premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, with Bernard Rose delivering the print personally after flying to Canada with the film in his luggage. Critically, it was very well received, with Rose recalling that after the premiere, one patron gave him a thumbs up sign in passing, and this was someone who he would later discover was the film critic Roger Ebert. And Ebert would go on to give the film an incredibly positive review, saying that it was, quote, "a film in which every image has been distilled to the point of almost frightening simplicity. This is not a movie to be measured and weighed and plumbed, but one to be surrendered to." End quote. Sadly, though, audiences were less than willing to surrender, and the film was not a commercial success, something that Bernard Rose commented on in a later interview with the website Sci-Fi Now. Quote, "It was always very well regarded, but completely ignored commercially. It was never a huge success in theatres. It got mixed reviews, but people in Hollywood liked it because they thought I might be somebody who could make thriller and horror films, which wasn't wrong. It certainly did me a lot of good in those terms, but the film didn't make any money. In the 1980s, that kind of genre was not taken seriously or admired the way it is now, but the film has had a huge afterlife thanks to people who really adored it." End quote. Even today, it is relatively difficult to track down, and although it was released in both France and Germany as special edition Blu-ray sets in 2013 and 2019 respectively, it is yet to receive the remaster in the UK that it truly deserves. Often spoken of in conversations alongside The Company of Wolves and Pan's Labyrinth, one can only hope that at some point in the future, some enterprising boutique Blu-ray company will give it a wider release, especially given its psychological depth, arresting visuals, and the pedigrees of its composer and director. After Paperhouse, Bernard Rose moved temporarily away from horror and directed a film called Chicago Joe and the Showgirl, a World War II set crime thriller starring Kiefer Sutherland based on a 1944 murder case. This film was neither a critical nor commercial success, but it did lead to an introduction with a young British director and writer who was filming his second movie on a soundstage in the same studios. That film was 1990's Nightbreed, and the writer-director was a man from Liverpool called Clive Barker. Clive Barker is an author, filmmaker, artist and poet, among many other things, who was born into a working-class household in October 1952 in Liverpool, England, and he has cited this upbringing as having a significant influence on his creative sensibilities. His father worked in industrial relations, and his mother was a welfare worker and, incredibly importantly, a painter, a talent that, if you have ever seen his artwork, was clearly also passed on to her son. After school, he studied English and philosophy at the University of Liverpool, where he became increasingly involved in performance art and experimental theatre, a discipline in which he immersed himself through much of the 1970s. During this period, he co-founded an avant-garde performance group called the Dog Company, and here he worked alongside Doug Bradley, who would later become iconic as Pinhead in the Hellraiser franchise, and Peter Atkins, who made a brief appearance in Hellraiser and who would go on to write the screenplays for Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, and Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth. Anticipating much of Barker's later work, over the early 1970s, Dog Company mounted surreal and transgressive stage productions, as well as producing short experimental films, all of which explored the themes of horror, sexuality, and religion. These films were very much inspired by the American experimental filmmaker and provocateur Kenneth Anger, and two of them, Salome, made in 1973, and The Forbidden, made in 1978, were eventually released on home video following the success of Hellraiser. Designed and printed in negative due to financial constraints, Barker has described these quote-unquote home movies as anticipating his later work, saying, quote, "These are movies that were made in people's cellars and front rooms with a lot of passion and no money. I think they are interesting little films, almost prophetic in a sense, particularly The Forbidden, with the atmosphere of dread and anxiety that hangs over the movie, and obviously the erotic elements. They definitely prefigure what we later see in the Hellraiser movies. Like a psychic's production of automatic writing, the work we create when we are young can be a powerful clue to what obsesses us. In a trance of innocence, without the demands of commerce or self-consciousness, we speak with the purity that is difficult to achieve in later work. Not that purity is necessarily a great artistic value. Some of the most boring art I know values that quality far too highly. But in the scrawl of an unwitting mind, there may be interesting codes to be broken." End quote. Barker's breakout work was a collection of short stories titled The Books of Blood, published across 6 volumes beginning in 1984. At that time, horror publishing was a far greater behemoth than it is now, more's the pity. Something that exploded, as we discussed a few weeks ago, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the success of the novels Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin, The Other by Thomas Tryon, and The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. This led to a new wave of horror authors, or perhaps more accurately led to publishing companies becoming more willing to take a chance on the macabre, with writers like James Herbert, Peter Straub, Ramsey Campbell, Dean Koontz and Stephen King dominating bookshelves in homes and in retail outlets. And this was also a time when, in my opinion at least, horror novels had far better cover art than the rather bland and tasteful imagery that we see today, but that might just be because that's what I grew up with. I certainly remember the artwork of James Herbert's The Fog giving me nightmares for weeks. With the publication of the Books of Blood, Barker was hailed by no less than Stephen King as the future of horror, while Ramsey Campbell, a fellow Liverpudlian, wrote the foreword for volumes 1 to 3. These collections contain stories that would also later go on to be adapted into film, including Rawhead Rex, which would be filmed rather terribly from Barker's own screenplay in 1986, The Lost Illusion, which Barker himself would direct as Lord of Illusions in 1995, The Midnight Meat Train, which was filmed in 2008, Dread from 2009, and an anthology film titled Books of Blood, which was released in 2020. As well as the screenplay for Rawhead Rex, which in my opinion is inspired more than a little by the movie Blood on Satan's Claw, Barker also wrote an original screenplay called Underworld, which was released in the US as Transmutations in 1985. And this is the same year in which he published his debut novel, The Damnation Game. Both Underworld and Rawhead Rex were directed by a man called George Pavlou, and Barker has effectively disowned both films, describing Underworld as a designer boredom movie, while saying that Rawhead Rex, which he thought marginally better, was spoiled by an incredibly bad 1960s monster. He also said that the film adaptation of Rawhead Rex missed the sexual symbolism that was central to his original story. For him, the whole movie, which he described as being about a 10-foot penis going on the rampage, had to smell of sex, which, as anyone who has seen it will tell you, it most certainly doesn't. But at the very least, their artistic failure inspired him to do much better with his next film project, saying that he felt he needed to compensate for those earlier movies. And this he most certainly did with his featured directorial debut, Hellraiser. This was based on his novella The Hellbound Heart and was released in the UK in 1987. We'll be discussing Hellraiser later in the series, but it's fair to say it was a resounding success, earning over 30 million worldwide from a budget of just 1 million. It also spawned a plethora of sequels, each with increasingly diminishing returns. However, post-production on Hellraiser was not a happy experience, with production company New World Pictures convincing Barker to redub many of the characters with American accents, despite the location being quite blatantly central London. 1987 also saw the publication of Barker's second novel, Weave World, an urban fantasy about a magical world hidden inside a carpet, and he followed this with the 1988 horror novella Cabal and my favourite of his novels, The Great and Secret Show, which was released in 1989. The novella Cabal would go on to form the basis of Barker's second directed feature, Nightbreed, which was released in 1990. This, though, would also be marred by studio interference, particularly in the final edit, and it was also very much damaged by a poor marketing campaign, which promoted the film as some kind of slasher, which it most certainly is not. As a result, the film was both a critical and commercial failure, though it has since gone on to be re-evaluated, and a director's cut of the film was finally released in 2009. As I mentioned, it was during the making of this film that he first met Bernard Rose, who was filming Chicago Joe and the Showgirl on another soundstage at Pinewood Studios in England. Intrigued enough by the meeting to read some of Barker's work, Rose started reading the Books of Blood and was immediately drawn to two stories as having possible filmic potential. The first of these was a story titled In the Flesh, a supernatural occult drama set in a prison, but he soon decided that, although it was very well written, it would be impossible to film. The second was a short story called The Forbidden, which, title aside, has absolutely nothing to do with the short film I mentioned earlier. And it was this story that would become the basis for our second film this week. All of which does indeed bring us on to our second film of the week, which is Candyman, written and directed by Bernard Rose and released in 1992. This stars Virginia Madsen, Tony Todd, Cassie Lemmons, Vanessa Williams and Xander Berkeley. And now we are getting into the spoilers for both the movie and the original short story, so if you haven't yet experienced either, now is the time to hit pause and return once you have. The story The Forbidden concerns a graduate student named Helen who, in researching her thesis, unwittingly attracts the attention of a supernatural presence known as Candyman. However, unlike the film, there is no invocation using mirrors, no backstory regarding racial prejudice, and the story is set on a council estate in Liverpool as opposed to the projects of Chicago. Of the adaptation, Barker has said that it was very much Bernard Rose's baby from the outset. The two shared an agent who contacted Barker and told him that Rose was interested in adapting some of his stories for film. The author had very much enjoyed Paperhouse, calling it tremendous and a quote-unquote smashing picture. And although he story conferenced with Rose and has some oversight, he said at the end of the day it is very much the director's film, going on to say that he considers it a tremendous piece of work. The Forbidden is set on a council estate, which for listeners outside of the UK are residential developments, generally managed by local councils to provide subsidised and affordable rental living. Introduced by the 1890 Housing of the Working Classes Act, the initial purpose was to clear slum properties, and this was then developed in 1919, when for the first time in the UK, government funding was used to build social housing. Following World War II, a massive building programme was launched to replace war-damaged property, and in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a peak in construction, with 1 million homes built between 1945 and 1955 alone. A noble and worthy effort to be sure, however many of these new developments were brutalist high-rise tower blocks, with once vibrant communities demolished and then placed one on top of the other to conserve space. By the 1960s and 1970s, inner city tower blocks became synonymous with crime and urban decay, something which Barker himself called an architectural and sociological disaster, adding that in at least 2 or 3 cases, the buildings simply collapsed. In The Forbidden, the council estate is called the Spectre Street Estate, and the reader gains an immediate understanding of Barker's perspective from the first 2 paragraphs of the story. Quote, "No doubt the estate and its 2 companion developments had once been an architect's dream. No doubt the city planners had wept with pleasure at a design which had 3 and 36 persons per hectare and still boasted space for a children's playground. Doubtless fortunes and reputations had been built on Spectre Street, and at its opening, fine words had been spoken of its being a yardstick by which all future developments would be measured. But the planners, tears wept, words spoken, had left the estate to its own devices. The architects occupied restored Georgian houses at the other end of the city, and probably never set foot here. They would not have been shamed by the deterioration of the estate, even if they had. Their brainchild, they would doubtless argue, was as brilliant as ever, its geometries as precise, its ratios as calculated. It was people who had spoiled Spectre Street. Nor would they have been wrong in such an accusation. Helen had seldom seen an inner-city environment so comprehensively vandalised. Lamps had been shattered and backyard fences overthrown. Cars whose wheels and engines had been removed and chassis then burned blocked garage facilities. In one courtyard, 3 or 4 ground-floor maisonettes had been entirely gutted by fire, their windows and doors boarded up with planks and corrugated iron." End quote. Into this environment enters graduate student Helen, who in this story is not studying urban legends, but instead graffiti, something which she calls the semiotics of urban despair. Her husband, Trevor, who is even more obnoxious in the story than he is in the film, is rather mocking of her project, telling her that the theme has been explored 100 times. But Helen is convinced that within the layers of spray paint and slogans, some clue might be found to a collective unconscious, a common meaning that combines her 2 favourite subjects of sociology and aesthetics. While photographing the paint-sprayed walls, she meets a young mother called Anne-Marie, who tells her firstly of the horrors of day-to-day life on Spectre Street, and then about a brutal murder of, quote, a friend of the sister of the woman next door, end quote, who was cut to ribbons in his own room by a man with a hook, something that Anne-Marie says was a bit like Jack the Ripper. Barker's story is driven by ideas of class and social decay, and it was these themes that initially attracted Bernard Rose because, according to the author, quote, he liked the idea of taking a horror story with some social undertones and making a movie out of it, end quote. And as the film was going to be made with American money from propaganda films, both men agreed that the story should be migrated to the States because, as Barker put it, they weren't going to be interested in a story set in Liverpool. A very accurate assessment of film production at the time, but also something that was probably coloured by Barker's own experiences with Hellraiser. Rose had already been to Chicago while attending a film festival and had been fascinated by the city's architecture. Returning to Chicago to scout for locations, he reportedly asked to be taken to the very worst area of the city, and on this request was taken to the housing project of Cabrini Green. Much like many of the council estates in Britain, Cabrini Green had been originally constructed as a response to World War II and had been a low-rise apartment complex for workers, housing a mix of underpaid Italians, Puerto Ricans, Irish and African Americans. High-rise extensions were added to the project in the late 1950s and early 1960s, as a response to the population explosion. But by the mid-1960s, racial segregation had set in, with the population of Cabrini Green becoming predominantly African American. In 1966, a community activist called Dorothy Gautreaux filed a lawsuit against the Chicago Housing Association, alleging that its public housing policies were racially discriminatory and that they also perpetuated racial segregation. And this lawsuit was successful, a result which prevented the CHA from constructing any further projects in what had become predominantly African American areas of the city. In 1968, riots erupted in Chicago following the assassination of Martin Luther King, and Cabrini Green, due to its geographical proximity to the wealthier neighborhoods, was effectively cordoned off. The Chicago Housing Authority stopped maintaining Cabrini Green due to lack of funds, and the project quickly became run down and synonymous with an increase in vandalism and violence, something which was depicted in the media as an example of the failure of public housing. In the Devil's Advocate's analysis of Candyman, written by John Towson, the writer highlights that this depiction was both misleading and rooted in racial bias, saying, quote, the sensationalist news accounts of delinquency and squalor in Cabrini Green failed to highlight the tenant activism and community action of the residents, most of whom were families. Many residents grouped together to support and protect each other, and to protest against the negligence of the CHA. Indeed, the success of the Gautreaux case created a legacy that affected public housing policy not only in Chicago, but across the entire US, bringing an end to public housing high-rises and expanding housing opportunities. It led to the construction of more housing for mixed-income communities, and brought about an end to racial discrimination in public housing policy. American popular culture tends to overlook positive tenant activism in its representations of city public housing and its residents. The power of the black working class collective and of social endeavour generally is less championed by the media, and undercurrents of racial and class discrimination remain in depictions of indolent poor blacks being themselves to blame for their situation. End quote. As we seem to discuss, rather depressingly, in every episode, nothing really changes much, does it? And we still see such arguments being made today, generally in media owned by billionaires. In the case of Cabrini Green, the disinvestment and ghettoization at the hands of the CHA and the Chicago governing bodies appear to have been the key contributing factors in the deterioration of the area, while high levels of poverty eventually led to an increase in gang activity and control. And this was certainly the case both when Rose first visited the project and also during filming. The producers worked with the Residents Association and employed local youths to act in the film, while Rose negotiated with the controlling gangs to also hire them as extras, ensuring that filming could be completed while also ensuring protection. And it is these very gang members who follow Helen and Bernadette as they first visit the project, adding a realism to the movie and, of course, to its central themes. Even then, though, the atmosphere was still somewhat volatile, and actor Cassie Lemmons, who plays Helen's ill-fated friend Bernadette, later recalled someone shooting at one of the generators, though she also went on to say, quote, "Cabrini Green is particularly notorious, and you don't know from what you see in the news flashes or from what you hear what you are going to find. But we found families, people just trying to survive, people with nice apartments, some better than others, and little kids. You know, beautiful little children." End quote. The decision to set the film in Cabrini led to a shift in subtext from Barker's story, which, among its many themes, is partly about the English class system. In the movie, the story is also about class, but this is defined through racial division and stereotyping, because, as Rose would put it, quote, "The whole point about Candyman is that he is a representative of people who are oppressed." End quote. In Barker's original story, the Candyman is a very different figure, a monstrous raggedy jester who is seen first in a mural painted on a wall and then in a physical encounter with Helen as she returns to the Spectre Street estate to continue her research. Quote, "He was bright to the point of gaudiness, his flesh a waxy yellow, his thin lips pale blue, his wild eyes glittering as if their irises were set with rubies. His jacket was a patchwork, his trousers the same. He looked, she thought, almost ridiculous, with his blood-stained motley and the hint of rouge on his jaundiced cheeks." End quote. And this is obviously quite a far cry from the Candyman of the movie, who Rose decided would have more in common with the tragic monsters of classic Gothics like Frankenstein, or more specifically, the Phantom of the Opera. To achieve this then, Rose needed an African-American actor who could deliver both menace and tragedy, an actor who could humanise the Candyman of his vision while still presenting sufficient menace. And one day, watching a TV movie about the ivory trade in Nairobi, he saw the actor Tony Todd. Tony Todd was born in December 1954 in Washington, D.C., but was raised in Hartford, Connecticut, where he first studied at the Hartford Public High School before attending the University of Connecticut. Interested in acting from an early age, he went on to train at the Eugene O'Neill National Theatre Institute and the Trinity Repertory Company in Rhode Island, a classical theatrical education that is clearly evident in his portrayal of Candyman and indeed across his entire career. His first acting job was with a travelling political theatre group called Modern Times Theatre, after which he relocated to New York, where he made numerous stage appearances. And it was here, in one stage performance, that he was spotted by a casting director who was working on Oliver Stone's 1986 Vietnam drama, Platoon. This director would cast Todd in what would become his feature film debut. Appearing in a multi-Oscar winning movie is certainly an impressive way to start your film career, and once Platoon opened he moved to LA, where he secured minor roles in films including the gangland drama Colors and the Charlie Parker biopic Bird, released in 1988. He also appeared in several TV shows, including the comedies Kate and Ally and Night Court, and then, in 1990, he secured the male lead role of Ben in the remake of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Although the idea of a remake of such a classic film usually fills me with dread, this one is a cut above the norm, helped in no small part by the fact that it was written by Romero and his original collaborators Russell Striner and John A. Russo, and it was also directed by frequent Romero collaborator Tom Savini, making his directorial debut. Co-starring Patricia Tallman, Bill Moseley and William Butler, As a remake, it stands up remarkably well, with enough of the original to satisfy the die-hard fans, while also subverting audience expectations and throwing in a few neat plot twists that are highly satisfying as opposed to merely gratuitous. And if you've not seen it, even if you are a lover of the original, then I highly recommend tracking it down. In the same year, he also appeared in Ivory Hunters, the TV movie, which introduced him to Bernard Rose. Rose immediately saw in him his vision for Candyman, and insisted to propaganda films that he was the right actor for the part, even refusing to audition anyone else for the role. And although propaganda were resistant, even suggesting Sidney Poitier for the part, Rose stood his ground. Tony Todd was Candyman, and for him, that was all there was to it. For a young actor still relatively new to the movies, this opportunity was incredible, although Todd later said that part of what attracted him to the role was curiosity. He wanted to know how they would manage the scene in which Candyman emits a stream of bees from his mouth. As it turned out, this would be achieved through using a special mouthpiece that would prevent live bees from entering his throat. He later said on the day of filming, quote, "The next thing I knew, there was a funnel in my mouth and they're pouring 300 moving creatures into it." End quote. And although he had been assured that the bees would be young enough to be relatively harmless, rather wisely, Todd negotiated a clause into his contract that, for each time he was stung, he would receive a bonus of $1,000, netting him an extra $23,000 as a result. But it wasn't just the curiosity about the bee effects that attracted him to the role, although he did say this was part of it. He was also attracted by the story, the complexity of the character, the social commentary, and the opportunity to develop Candyman's backstory alongside Bernard Rose. In Barker's original tale, the Candyman has no real backstory. He is a mysterious presence, an urban legend made real, but with little to account for his appearance, his violence, or indeed the ever-present swarm of bees that surround him as much in the text as they do in the film. For the movie, Todd and Rose worked closely together to develop the character, creating Daniel Robitaille, the freed son of a slave, who would be brutally murdered for the crime of falling in love. In a 2014 interview with the film magazine Empire, Todd described this process in detail, saying, quote, "We didn't want to make him just some generic bogeyman. Bernard and I wanted to make sure he was steeped in a kind of gothic American racial history, especially as the story had been transposed from Liverpool to Cabrini Green. We mutually decided that he was an artist, and from that came the idea of the painting, and once we had that, we knew it was going to be Phantom of the Opera. Once I had all that, I knew how to make him human, in spite of the fact that he's a ghost. Having grown up in America just as the civil rights movement started, I could completely relate to him." End quote. Although Todd's screen time totals less than 10 minutes, his performance, and particularly his mellifluous and hypnotic voice, commands the entire film. Standing at 6'5" and dressed immaculately in a fur-lined coat and period-accurate houndstooth trousers, Candyman is possibly the most dignified and classy of all of the horror antagonists, a seductive and charismatic villain with a domineering personality that is, in my opinion, head and shoulders above the likes of Jason, Michael, and Ghostface. Any actor can, and indeed has played those characters, but only Tony Todd can play Candyman. And this is something that became quickly apparent through the 2021 reboot, though more on that a little bit later. As Todd himself said in the same Empire interview, Candyman is unique, a powerful and demented force of nature who also walks with pride. As Daniel Robitaille was educated in the highest European society, Todd took fencing, riding and waltzing classes, while the fact that the character was an artist also gave an added dimension to the character, with the mutilation to his painting hand bringing his justified sense of loss and rage sharply into focus. But the casting of a black actor still made the producers nervous, to the extent that they insisted Rose meet with the NAACP to discuss the screenplay. But, as it turns out, in this they needn't have worried, as Rose recalled that they asked him why they were even having the meeting. They found the script to be fine, arguing, quote, "Why shouldn't a black actor be a ghost? Why shouldn't a black actor play Freddy Krueger or Hannibal Lecter? If you're saying they can't be, it's really perverse." End quote. But even then, Candyman did cause controversy at the time of its production and later on its release. The Chicago Tribune ran a story about the film under the headline, "Black Slasher Candyman Draws Fire Over Racist Depictions," and the African-American filmmaker Carl Franklin expressed concern about the film's representation of its black male antagonist. He likened Candyman's obsession with a white woman to King Kong, and objected to the fact that he seemed to be exacting revenge on his own community, which he felt would reinforce perceptions of black-on-black violence. He went on to say, quote, "There's no question that this film plays on white, middle-class fears of black people. It unabashedly uses racial stereotypes and destructive myths to create shock." End quote. This is a rather difficult thing for me to comment on. As I've said before, as a white, middle-aged and middle-class man living in England, I don't think I have much agency to discuss this argument with any real nuance or indeed any real insight. But the fact that the film has legions of black fans would suggest that there are plenty who would disagree with him. But even today, there are still those who argue that the film, written and directed by a white filmmaker, trades on race as a commodity, and I suspect this debate will continue for as long as Candyman remains in the public consciousness, which, given its enduring popularity, I imagine will be far into the future. Although there are significant changes from Barker's original story, many of the bones of the forbidden can still be seen throughout the film. Both deal with the nature of urban legends, with the murders reported in the story interpreted by several characters as modern fairy tales, underlined by the fact that they were apparently told by the, quote, "sister of the woman who used to live next door," end quote. In the story, the killer stems from the urban legend of the Hook, a tale which is repeated over dinner by the character Purcell, a pious and preening academic who also features in the film, where he recounts the story of Daniel Robitaille in a similar setting. The film, however, introduces the idea of summoning Candyman via a chant and a mirror, something very much inspired by the legend of Bloody Mary, which I remember doing the rounds back in the 1970s. Interestingly, following the film's release, there were those who believed that Candyman and his summoning ritual were actual urban legends, as opposed to being something created simply for the film. Another similarity between the two lies in the crimes that have occurred at Spectre Street and at Cabrini Green, and that in both cases they were inspired, very sadly and horrifically, by real events. In the story, Helen is told of a man with learning difficulties who was attacked with a razor in a public toilet, quote, "and they cut off his private parts, just cut them off and flushed them down the toilet," end quote. This story is also repeated in the movie, and was inspired by stories told by Barker's grandmother, who warned him to be careful to ensure that the same did not happen to him. This was quite possibly a distortion of a real case, that of William MacDonald, who became known as the Sydney Mutilator for doing much the same thing. Although MacDonald's crimes were committed in Sydney, Australia, he had been born and raised in Liverpool before emigrating, and the reporting of his crimes would no doubt have reached Barker's grandmother's ears, as well as the rest of the Liverpudlian community. In Candyman, we also learn of the murder of Ruthie Jean, slaughtered in her own apartment by a killer who literally came through her walls, with Helen later realising that this was through a bathroom cabinet and a shared recess. And this, very sadly, was clearly inspired by the 1987 murder of a Chicago resident called Ruthie Mae McCoy, who was killed in her own home in much the same way, an incident that exposed the dangers of the Chicago Housing Authority's cheap building design. As I've said before, this isn't a true crime podcast, but there are many out there who have covered this tragedy in great detail, and the information is also all online if you want to find out more. The Forbidden and Candyman also present the idea that the Candyman needs people to believe in him to maintain his own existence. In the story, he tells Helen, quote, "I am a rumour. It's a blessed condition, believe me, to live in people's dreams, to be whispered at street corners, but not have to be." End quote. This sentiment is also echoed in the movie, with the line, "I am the whisper in the classroom," the writing on the wall. And in both the film and the story, Candyman offers Helen an eternal life through urban mythology, presenting the idea that it is through collective belief that he maintains his power. Rose has expanded on this idea in interviews, saying that ultimately, quote, "Candyman really poses the question that if God exists because we believe in him, what would happen if the worship ceased? Would there be a 5-minute period where God is running on belief? And would he try to win his followers back?" End quote. Dialogue from the story also appears throughout the movie, including the conversation between Helen and Candyman at their first meeting, and the much-quoted lines, "What's blood for, if not for shedding? Be my victim," and my particular favourite, "What do the good know, except what the bad teach them by their excesses?" And it's not just the spoken dialogue. The graffiti, "Sweets to the sweet," appears in both versions, a line that originates from Hamlet and also the Bible, and was also inspired by a label on an English product called Lyle's Golden Syrup. For those outside of the UK, this is similar to maple syrup or molasses or honey, but is really not quite any of them. As its name suggests, it is a sugary golden syrup that is used in baking and drizzled over pancakes, and it is manufactured in the UK by a company called Tate and Lyle. Rather bizarrely, since its first production in 1883, its label has featured a decomposing lion surrounded by a swarm of bees, with the legend, "Out of the strong came forth sweetness." And no, I really have no idea why they use that either. But bizarre or not, and let's face it, it is, these origins are also honoured in the movie, with Helen's last name changed from the Buchanan of the original text to Helen Lyle. Helen is played rather brilliantly, in my opinion, by Virginia Madsen, who was not actually the first choice to play the role. In an interview on the Arrow Video Special Edition release, she says that the role was originally intended for Rose's then wife, the actor Alexandra Pigg, with Madsen originally in line to play the ill-fated friend Bernadette. When Pigg fell pregnant, it was she who championed Madsen for the role, something about which the director was initially uncertain due to Madsen's icy cold beauty. In another interview, she expanded on this further, saying, quote, "Bernard didn't really see me as Helen. I had to kind of grow into that. Bernard saw me as being too beautiful. He knew that I was a smart woman, that I was strong, that I was from Chicago, that I was down to earth, but physically he saw me as glamorous." As we know, of course, Rose changed his opinion, though Madsen would later joke that her preparation simply involved eating multiple pizzas so that she could gain the weight necessary for her to play the part. But this, of course, was not the only preparation that she undertook. Another aspect, very notoriously, were visits to a hypnotist, accompanied by Rose, who was given trigger words and techniques to induce her into a trance state for key moments, such as when Helen meets Candyman for the first time, and later when the two are in his lair at Cabrini Green. Madsen had said that she didn't believe she would be a good subject for hypnosis, but one visit to the therapist proved this wrong. And while it creates a dazzling effect on screen, particularly in the strange focus in her eyes during the key moments, she has said, quite understandably, that she would never allow another director to do that again. Although the film is of course about Candyman, it is also the story of Helen Lyle, a woman trapped in a loveless marriage who is betrayed by a cheating husband and then undermined by the supremely obnoxious Purcell. Helen is looking not only for the subject of her thesis, but also for self-validation and an escape from the solitude of both her work and stultifying domesticity. It is this that drives her deeper into her research and also into incredible risk-taking, entering Candyman's lair to take photographs as Bernadette wakes nervously outside, breaking into neighbouring apartments through a bathroom mirror, and then venturing into Cabrini alone, something that brings her into contact with a local drug lord who is using the myth of Candyman for his own ends. Helen is intelligent, curious and brave, and even though some of her decisions are, admittedly, a little unwise, she is certainly not a victim of her own stupidity. It is quite apparent, as the story progresses, that her ageing husband Trevor has chosen a young student as his lover, not just because he prefers them younger, but because Helen is a threat to his masculinity and intellect. And this is actually something we see from the very beginning, when he lectures his students on urban legends, despite knowing it's going to undermine her research. Even after her death, his memories of her are as a little homemaker, as opposed to the intelligent, vibrant and intrepid woman that she actually is. Little wonder then that she finds both the myth and the reality of Candyman so seductive, a dynamic that draws the film into the world of Gothic romance. We've already mentioned that some commentators have found the dynamic between the two controversial, and this also extended to the American censor, who found the idea of an interracial romance between the two objectionable. As a result, the sequence between Helen and Candyman in his lair near the climax of the film was cut extensively, and Tony Todd was later critical of this, quite understandably, saying, quote, "They were okay with a tall black man covered in bees, but when it came to a little kiss, they suddenly got scared." End quote. The bees presented something of an issue for Virginia Madsen, who, as it turned out, was incredibly allergic to bee stings, something that was proven by multiple hospital tests before production began. To mitigate this, the scenes in Candyman's lair used baby bees that had yet to develop true stinging ability, and paramedics were also on site to provide adrenaline shots should an allergic reaction take hold. Even then though, Madsen has recounted that filming this scene did cause anxiety, particularly given that she and Todd were housed within giant netting to prevent the bees from escaping, while most of the crew wore protective clothing and remained the other side of the net. And this is something that is more than a little reminiscent of Tippi Hedren and the filming of The Birds. For a while, the film seems to be suggesting that Candyman is all in Helen's imagination, and that her trance-like states indicate a form of psychotic fugue under which she goes on the rampage. And this is particularly true in the incredibly uncomfortable scene where she is strip-searched by the police. Even the graffiti on the wall in Candyman's den, which reads, "It was always you, Helen," could be interpreted as suggesting that she has been committing the murders all along. It is really only the killing of her psychiatrist when she is bound to a chair and the climax of the movie that prove otherwise, and in this light the writing on the wall takes on a very different significance. The paintings that surround it depict a very Helen-like figure as Candyman's historical lover, and so it is possible that, much as in Bram Stoker's Dracula, she is Candyman's love reborn, or, at the very least, the two bear a striking resemblance. Another possible interpretation, though, is that this was always Helen's destiny, and that it is less her own actions that bring her to the film's climax, and more that this would have been her destination, regardless. In any case, the true climax of the film, wherein Helen saves Anne-Marie's baby and also kills Candyman, suggests that she is still a woman of independence, somebody who is willing to destroy herself to do the right thing, killing the monster and saving an innocent child. The journey of discovery that she undertakes then is perhaps less an exploration of urban legend and more a journey to the heart of who she actually is, not the homemaker or the university student or indeed even Candyman's victim, but a woman who overcomes the patriarchy and who is ultimately heroic, even though her fate reminds us of Nietzsche's warning about the consequences of fighting monsters. The epilogue of the film, where philandering Trevor finally gets what he deserves, is enormously satisfying, but this was not the ending originally written in either Barker's story or the original screenplay. In the story, Helen burns to death within the bonfire, possibly to become a legend, but then again, most likely not. And the original screenplay also took a different approach, with Helen's body bricked up behind a wall at Cabrini, one that is covered by a mural of her image, and therefore fully incorporating her into the myth. In the end, Rose went a different route, though the depiction of Helen's mural still appears beneath the closing credits, ensuring that the viewer gets the satisfaction of seeing Trevor's comeuppance while still retaining the core of the original idea. As well as the central performances, intriguing themes, and comparatively infrequent on-screen violence, Candyman is distinguished from other 90s horror movies by an ethereal and haunting score from the composer Philip Glass, who composed his tracks after seeing a rough cut of the finished film. Rose and his editor, Dan Ray, then made the final cuts against Glass's demo recordings, creating a synergy between sound and vision that was completed when the demos were orchestrated against the final cut of the film. From the minimalist notes beneath the opening credits to the gentle piano piece of Helen's theme, it is a beautiful piece of work, and it is a shame that, initially at least, Glass appeared rather embarrassed by the association. Believing himself to have been manipulated into writing a score for a blood and guts slasher as opposed to the more art house project he had believed it to be, he removed the film from his CV and was rather ambivalent about releasing a soundtrack album. This, however, seems to have been an initial reaction only. He subsequently allowed elements of the score to be used in the sequel and also collaborated with Rose on later projects, so perhaps the initial shock of Candyman was just a little bit too much. Candyman received its premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival in 1992 as part of the Midnight Madness segment, and was then released in the US on October the 16th, 1992. This, though, was only 6 months after the LA riots, following the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers charged with using violence during the arrest of Rodney King. Coming at a time of great racial tensions, there was concern among studio executives that the film would be seen as racist, with Clive Barker saying that the studio believed there were going to be mass demonstrations and fistfights and worse at cinemas where Candyman was playing. These concerns, however, proved unfounded, and the film was largely embraced by black communities. It also opened the way for its star, Tony Todd, to begin work with inner-city communities. Quote, "One positive thing I've been able to do, because gang members love that film so fucking much, I get a lot of work as a gang interventionist. We use Candyman to open up a dialogue, and we talk about things. One of my dream projects is a foundation where teenagers of different backgrounds can be taken someplace every year just to get them together and see that there's a different world out there. Talk to them about the disparities between culture and classes in this society, and hopefully they come back and spread whatever joy they've got. I want that to be my legacy." End quote. Perhaps predictably, the critical reception was somewhat mixed. The LA Times was particularly critical, calling the film ambitious but pretentious, and saying that it quickly became as repellent as it was preposterous. Others, though, were far less critical. The Washington Post praised the performances and also the political subtext, particularly in the character of Anne-Marie, who has some very pointed dialogue regarding the connections between poverty, racism, and oppression. The New York Times praised its unusually high interest in social issues, and Roger Ebert scored the film 3 out of 4, praising Candyman as a movie that scared him as much with its ideas as much as it did its gore. Initially, Bernard Rose was lined up to make a sequel that would have run across multiple timelines and incorporated elements of another Barker story The Midnight Meat Train. Perhaps predictably though, the studio wasn't interested in a different story and just wanted more of the same. And though they had been contractually obligated to offer Rose first shot at the screenplay, they rejected his ideas pretty much out of hand. The first sequel, Candyman Farewell to the Flesh, was released in 1995 and was directed by Bill Condon, who would go on to direct the brilliant Gods and Monsters in 1988 and the not quite so brilliant Twilight Saga Breaking Dawn in 2011. Although Tony Todd himself was involved in elements of the screenplay which went much further to highlight themes of racism and segregation, the film itself was for me something of a disappointment, let down by rather pedestrian direction, despite superb performances from Todd and from horror icon Veronica Cartwright. It is at least better than the film which followed, Candyman 3 Day of the Dead, which was released in 1999 and went direct to video, which probably says it all. In 2021, the franchise was rebooted with a requel produced by Jordan Peele and directed by Nia DaCosta, but for me it was something of a disappointment. The ideas and the direction are excellent, particularly in the use of shadow puppetry, but from my perspective it is marred by the deaths of random characters who are barely introduced and hard to care about, particularly when compared to the deaths in the first film, which are painful to experience because the characters seemed far more real. It was, however, wildly successful and received good reviews from many critics as well as from viewers, so, as always, that's just my opinion. Following Candyman, Bernard Rose moved into other genre, including the historical biographical drama Immortal Beloved, starring Gary Oldman as the composer Beethoven in 1994, and Anna Karenina in 1997. In the year 2000, he directed and co-wrote the excellent Hollywood drama Ivan's XTC, starring regular collaborator Danny Huston as a Hollywood agent dying of lung cancer. A scathing critique of Hollywood excess, it was particularly significant for its use of digital filmmaking, very unusual for the time, and marked him further as a groundbreaking and experimental filmmaker. It's a rather forgotten movie, based on a story by Leo Tolstoy, but it is definitely worth looking out for if you haven't seen it. He returned to horror with 3 later films, Snuff Movie in 2005, SX Tape in 2013, and Frankenstein in 2015, which reunited him with Tony Todd. I have to say, I haven't seen any of these movies, although some have said Frankenstein is among his best work, so that is something I plan to rectify as soon as possible. And as of the time of recording, he is currently in post-production on a drama called Lear Rex, based on William Shakespeare's King Lear, with an all-star cast including Al Pacino, Jessica Chastain, Danny Huston, and Peter Dinklage. Clive Barker continues to work across multiple media, including novels, comics, paintings, and video games. His novels include Everville, the follow-up to the Great and Secret Show, the Arabat series, Imagica, Sacrament, and the quite brilliant Cold Heart Canyon. This is a homage to the glory days of Hollywood, which, as we know and as he depicts, were not so glorious after all. And while it would be pretty impossible, I suspect, to turn into a movie, I have to admit I would love to see somebody talented give it a go. In early 2024, he announced that he would stop attending public events so that he could focus more on his writing, as he was working on the manuscripts for 31 different projects, some closer to completion than others. So, all being well, and Barker's health permitting, there should hopefully be much, much more to come. Tony Todd went on to appear in over 240 film and TV productions, which is of course far too many to name, though some of these include The Rock, the Final Destination franchise, the Hatchet franchise, Wishmaster, Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek Voyager, Criminal Minds, and, as I mentioned, Bernard Rose's Frankenstein. He also made numerous stage appearances and lent his distinctive vocal talents to multiple animations and video games. In an interview given for the Arrow Video Blu-ray release of Candyman, he said that despite having made over 200 movies, he anticipated that in his obituary, Candyman would appear within the first 3 lines, and that he would have no problem with that at all. It is with great sadness that I can confirm that in this, he was correct. He passed away on the 6th of November 2024 at the age of 69. A year prior, in 2023, he joined the cast of Final Destination Bloodlines, where he secretly let producers know that he had terminal stomach cancer. During filming, they elected to allow him to improvise the final lines of his character Mr. Bloodworth, allowing him to say goodbye to his legions of fans. He said, quote, "Life is precious. Enjoy every second. You never know when. Good luck." End quote. Paperhouse and Candyman are of course both films directed by Bernard Rose, and both tell stories that hover somewhere between grim reality and an even grimmer fantasy. One is the story of a young girl encountering the horrors of burgeoning adulthood and her first encounter with death, and the other is the story of a grown woman who, in encountering death, learns the true nature of her identity. Together they create an exploration of identity, trauma, family dysfunction, social commentary, and the gossamer walls between supernatural horror and psychological collapse, themes which in both cases linger long after the credits have concluded. All of which brings me to the end of what has turned out to be an incredibly long episode, so if you are still with me, thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please also consider sharing this episode with any horror-loving friends. You can also contact the show via email at thehorrordouble@gmail.com or follow our Instagram, thehorrordouble. Next week, we are continuing our anniversary celebration with a return to our roots and some of the themes that we explored in our very first episode, with 2 stories about multiple murderers in absolutely every sense of the expression. First up, we have The Week of the Killer, directed by Eloy de la Iglesia and released in 1972. This was released outside of Spain with the incredibly exploitative and incredibly misleading title of Cannibal Man, and so it is under that title you will find it if you are outside of Spain. I'm not entirely sure why it was called that, as there is no cannibalism at all in the movie, apart from a very vague inference, but just as a heads up, there are some real scenes shot in a slaughterhouse that are genuinely upsetting. So if you are vegetarian or vegan, or if you're an omnivore and really don't want to know where your food comes from, you might want to give this one a bit of a wide berth. And then we follow that with another film from the great Mario Bava. This is The Ecology of a Crime from 1971, better known in English as A Bay of Blood, a far more suitable English language title than Cannibal Man to be certain, but still rather exploitative and not quite as evocative as the original Italian. This is also a film which went on to inspire the American slasher movement, particularly entries in the Friday the 13th series, so expect some discussions about that alongside the usual cinematic rabbit holes. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. Until then, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for the past year, and have a really great week. Goodbye.